Hola y bienvenidos a este nuevo podcast de Dot Magazine, donde hoy tenemos el placer de tener como invitada a Liz Pelly, la periodista musical con base en Nueva York, que justamente este mes ha publicado un libro titulado Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist. Liz es una profesional muy reconocida por su mirada crítica hacia la industria del streaming y en este libro habla de cómo Spotify ha transformado la manera en que consumimos música, los algoritmos detrás de nuestras playlists favoritas y algunas prácticas no demasiado limpias por parte de la plataforma de origen sueco. La entrevista será en inglés, así que ya me perdonaréis el inglés, pero os aviso y os pido que escuchéis la entrevista porque es súper interesante. Hey Liz, how's it going?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your time. It's an honor for me to have you as the first international guest on the podcast. I believe your book should be mandatory reading not only for those of us who are part of the music industry in some way, but also for music consumers who cares about preserving it as a cultural asset. So, before we dive into the topics covered in your book, could you briefly tell us what led you to investigate and write about Spotify and the streaming industry?
Sure. So, I started writing this book, Mood Machine, around 2022. But at that point, I had written a series of essays about Spotify and streaming. Starting in my first one was published in 2017. So, articles had been coming out for about 5 years at that point. And I think when I first started researching Spotify, which would have been in 2016, there were a few different things that were going on. One is that it was a period of time where I feel like I was just surrounded by a lot of musicians who were talking about streaming and the issues with streaming a lot. And on one hand, I kind of wanted to understand it more, but then also it seemed like, my first article was about the influence of major labels on Spotify playlists. And it just seemed like something that people speculated about, but I hadn't really seen anyone dive in and report on it before. So that was interesting to me. I had been working as a music journalist, freelance music journalist for about a decade at that point. And I think part of it also was just, when you're a freelance music journalist, there are certain things you do, like you write album reviews, interview bands about their new records, like write blurbs for lists of the 30 best albums that came out this year. And I think I just was like in this moment where I was sort of like, what else can I do with music journalism? So I made this list of stories that felt kind of more investigative to me. Of course, now that I've been writing about Spotify for all this time, I'm like, wow, I wish someone would just ask me to write about a band, so it's, the grass is always greener sort of thing. And then lastly, I always, like to mention, when I first started writing that first article, I also had recently, the year before, read this book by Asher Taylor called The People's Platform. That was this book that made a really big impact on me, sort of debunking this idea that the internet had democratized culture. And, that book talks about music a bit too, but even after reading it, I was left thinking, like there's so many ways in which to apply the lessons of this to the current music industry. And I think that was a big influence on wanting to dive into unpacking the digital moment in the mid-2010s a little bit too.
Writing a book like Mood Machine seems like a massive project in terms of research. What was the main challenge during this process?
During the research process?
Yeah,
it's interesting because, I feel like when you start writing about something like Spotify, for me, I think in the early years of writing it, I was looking at, okay, like let's look at the interface. Like when you open this app, like what do you see? And just start like asking questions about that. Like how did this come to be what I'm seeing right now? Like what are the different influences that shape it? And that was kind of like an entry point at first, was just sort of doing these kind of like, unpacking the listener experience. But yeah, as I dove in more, I started drawing from, other sources too. So for the book, I'd say the main research that went into it was in interviews. So I did a series. I did like around 100 interviews with musicians, people who work at independent record labels, former Spotify employees, just people who worked in the music business around the time that Spotify launched. But then I also interviewed like academic researchers. There's been so much really interesting academic research on streaming, and it was kind of interesting to bring some of that into this and read like organizers, like union organizers who have been trying to organize in the music space. I went to Sweden a couple of times and interviewed some people in Sweden because that's where Spotify was founded. Um, and yeah, interviewing musicians is really important to me. I think in music business writing, musicians' voices often get left out, especially independent musicians. Also, so much writing about the streaming economy over the years has been through the lens of the major labels and the mainstream music business. In some ways for good reason, because the major labels are, like partners to these companies. But I also wanted to try to write a little bit of the story of how did the independent labels get on board with this model, and like why were independent musicians convinced to embrace streaming as well. So there were the interviews, and then also some of my own research into the Spotify interface, like different kind of platform experiments. I got to review a lot of internal documents and conversations that was really helpful in piecing together some of the more investigative aspects of the book. And then I guess, the last part would be kind of like in-person observation. So this is like a really digital story. A lot of it exists online and is kind of like abstract. So any opportunity that I had to go report something in person, whether it be like going to a Spotify Stages show or like going to a protest that some musicians are organized, I tried to bring some elements of that into the book because, just to kind of like ground it a little bit in some like real stuff happening in the real world, so it was like a bunch of different sources.
Cool. One of the central topics in your book is that strange thing called ghost artists and Spotify's perfect fit content program, what you call later PFC. Can you briefly explain what it is and how it works?
Yeah. So, lots of people who have been following discourse around streaming or just kind of follow the music press or music business press, I think for years have been hearing about this phenomenon, right? Like that Spotify's been filling its playlists with fake artists, as they often get called in the press. Music Business Worldwide, which is one of the main music industry trade publications, first covered it in 2016. A source, told them that Spotify was making their own artists to fill out lean back background listening playlists. And Spotify pretty quickly, denied publicly that they were creating these tracks, but never really denied that there was some sort of broader arrangement at play. So in 2022, more reporting on it came out in the Swedish daily newspaper DN. They were able to take these various like copyright documents in Sweden to prove that there were hundreds of artist monikers and hundreds of tracks across Spotify that were like on the Spotify curated playlists that were attributed to this really small handful of songwriters, and that a lot of them were connected to these Swedish companies, Epidemic Sound and Firefly Entertainment. But there were still a lot of questions about, well, how do these tracks get onto these playlists? Is there actually some sort of formal relationship with Spotify? So when I started working on my book, I started looking into it a little bit more, interviewing former Spotify employees, I tried really hard to get musicians who were on some of these playlists to try to like dig up their contact information and tried to get some of them to talk to me. I was able to talk to a few musicians who make music for these stock music companies. What I outlined in the 2 chapters in the book on this program and what I was able to kind of piece together is that there is this small department within Spotify, this team, it gets referred to as, the PFC team within the editorial operation. It's these editors that look after this small group of playlists, small team of editors that look after specifically these mood playlists, background playlists, mostly instrumental music, the kind of stuff that you would see on like a ambient chill or like, study beats or deep sleep kind of playlist, deep focus kind of playlist. And then there's this, list of specific licensors who are these production music companies or stock music companies that are commissioning musicians to make this content, releasing it under, a series of different monikers. Oftentimes you might have like one musician who gets hired by one of these companies to crank out like dozens of songs, and they'll just attribute like a few songs to different moniker, and 3 songs to this moniker, 3 songs to this moniker, whatever, just, give an example. Yeah. And then those production companies that hire them like have this, privileged relationship with Spotify where they're licensing the music to Spotify at rates that are favorable to Spotify. They refer to it as a cost-saving initiative or as a music commissioned to fit specific moods and playlists at improved margins. So, that there's some sort of cost-saving relationship there. And then, the music gets served to Spotify, and there's these, Spotify denies on the record, that any licensor, any artist is guaranteed playlist placement in their contracts. But I was able to review instances of, this team internally talking about the new music that these licensors had provided and, make sure you check this out, make sure you get it added to your playlist, that kind of stuff. So there clearly is some sort of privileged relationship there.
For this book, you interviewed several musicians involved in the PFC program, but what did they tell you about it? Were they fully informed about what the outcome of their work would be?
The musicians who are making the work? Yeah, that was some of the most interesting conversations that I had, because there was this moment while I was doing the reporting where I was having conversations with musicians who were making music for companies that I knew were on the list of PFC licensors, but I realized that I knew a lot more about the arrangement than they did, because a lot of these musicians would, say things like, well, I don't know, I just make the music and I submit it and I get paid and I'm not really sure what happens after that. And that was really interesting to me, just like the level of alienation, the level of abstraction, even for the musicians who are making this work. And something that was really important for me to like drive home is that even the musicians who are making this music for these playlists, like they're not these, scammer type people who are trying to steal royalties from other artists. Like a lot of them are just musicians who are doing this as a side gig, who actually, don't have a lot of information about what it is they're participating in, but who maybe see it separately from their own musical practice, or they make music and then they do this on the side, because it's, how they're able, one of the many revenue streams that they're able to piece together in the streaming era, but that even for people who are participating in it, like in some cases they're agreeing to royalty rates that are unfavorable or like, less ideal than if they would be releasing the music on their own.
Spotify is transforming music in a way that often reduces it just to background noise rather than something with real cultural value. Do you think Spotify's long-term vision or strategy in some areas involves using AI to replace musicians in high percentage?
Yeah, I think something we know is that Daniel Ek has already gone on the record saying that he is, okay with generative AI content being on Spotify. Actually thinks generative AI content could be good culturally for Spotify and for music, and that there is a lot of generative AI music on the platform already, and in some cases, being added to playlists. I think there's a lot of really urgent conversations happening around generative AI music, you know, on streaming, but even beyond, just, you know, like there's a really, I think, dire need to be really critical of these companies, like not just streaming services, but companies like, you know, in my book, I write about this company, Boomy, that makes generative AI music that, you know, their claim is that, you know, they're not making generative AI music with music, like copyrighted music. But just because that's the case doesn't necessarily mean that what's happening is ethical. And that's something that is like worth keeping in mind. And there's other companies like Suno, which, you know, even just like this past week, there was this quote from the CEO of Suno, this generative AI music company, floating around the internet where he was saying, you know, making music, like most people don't like making music. You have to learn how to play an instrument. You have to learn how to use production software. You have to spend a really long time getting good at your instrument. And it's like, you know, this person is very clearly like really disconnected from the reality of why a lot of people are interested in music or interested in making it or listening to it. Like, yeah, like there is some effort that is involved in learning how to play music, but also, you know, most people who are involved in music, even peripherally, know that so much of the most beautiful music that exists is like a person strumming four chords, and it's actually not that hard on a technical level to do, you know, and that a lot of the joy of playing music is, you know, being bad at it at first and practicing and, you know, like maybe getting better, but maybe also staying really rudimentary. And like the point isn't always to like reach some sort of high level of technical proficiency. It's just like this way of thinking about not even just making music. I feel like there's really, you know, a lot of the conversation around AI and music focuses on generative AI, but I also think that there's a need to be as critical of the ways in which machine learning and AI systems and algorithmic recommendations for the past, you know, 15 years have reshaped the way that people discover music and the context within which music is presented. I think there's a kind of a similar thing where a lot of these companies have in their mind this idea of a listener who opens a streaming app, and like the idea of choosing music is just like impossible, and they don't want to like think about music, and they just want to be provided the perfect recommendation at the perfect moment. And I think similar to the way like that quote from the Suno CEO really underestimates the reasons why people play music, I also think that in some ways, you know, streaming companies being convinced that people open the app and don't want to think is also kind of underestimating listeners too. Like, I'm not really sure if that's true. I think it's just, you know, what people are confronted with when they open the app. So they choose the path of least resistance. But if it wasn't there, you know, I'm not sure if people would be deleting their accounts because they haven't been given like the most seamless, convenient button to click the second they open an app. But
over the past months, I've talked with different artists and bands about AI, and it seems like there is no unified opinion yet. But my impression is that everyone is watching carefully what is happening without doing much, and also that AI is seen as a threat in general. What do you think about AI and its role in the music industry? And what did you heard about this topic from the musicians you talk with?
that people see generative AI as a threat. I think, you know, yeah, I think that musicians are right to kind of like be asking really hard questions of this, because yeah, I think that maybe what is so like refreshing is that I think there is kind of this like really wholesale rejection of generative AI music amongst music communities and music listeners. Now, like AI is one of those complicated things where like it almost is kind of this like meaningless term at this point. It means so many different things. In some ways, I think there are ways in which some musicians use AI tools in their music creation process that are like completely harmless. Like, if it's like something having to do with like, mixing or something like, and I think that in a lot of ways, like AI has just become this like story about a specific way of thinking about like musicians and listeners being squeezed in new ways. But I do kind of think that it's important to, like really unpack the phrase and be more specific in some ways when we're talking about it, because there's so many reasons to be skeptical of it and to reject like certain things about it. But also it almost kind of like when you talk about it in this, it kind of reminds me of like for years, we would talk about like the quote unquote, the algorithm. And it's the phrase that kind of doesn't really mean anything. Even with something like Spotify, like I'm always really try to be really careful about being more precise. Like on Spotify, there is the algorithm. Like there's like different types of data that they collect, and there's different recommendation models that they build with different pools of data. And then there's different products that they make based on different models, recommendation models, but it's not like there's one algorithm. And in some ways, like when you kind of like generalize in that way, it almost is like giving these systems like too much power or something. But I also understand that it's like complicated.
Yeah, totally. I guess that the consumers, like people who listen to music, has also an important role in all this puzzle, right? Because I guess that we always talk about like, okay, musicians need to do something just to not fall into the trap of this type of platforms like Spotify. But I guess that like people who consume the music also has something important to say on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like in my book, I try to talk about how, simultaneously, I think it's important to both, think about ways in which the streaming model could be made more transparent and more fair for musicians and listeners, while at the same time supporting efforts to create alternatives that exist completely outside of it, or remembering the importance of supporting alternative systems and ecosystems that exist completely outside of the mainstream corporate music industry. So it's sort of, similar to the purpose that independent music or alternative music or whatever phrase you want to use to describe it, but the network, the independent networks that have always or have long existed outside the mainstream music business have existed for a reason. And something that is unique about streaming, I think, is that it has sort of like pulled the independent music world closer to the mainstream music business, and kind of, made all of us, or many of us, reliant on the tools of the pop machine in these new ways. So remembering, that is the reality of what these tools are, and the importance of also, either as an alternative or a supplement, directly engaging in supporting the alternative ecosystems that you want to see, the culture that you want to see exist in the world, whether it be through buying music directly from musicians and independent record labels, like supporting independent music retail in person and online, supporting independent music media, because I think, a lot of the issues of the streaming era are also issues of media consolidation and continuing to kind of like seek out independent voices and media projects is, I think, really important to keeping the independent music ecosystem like, cohered in some ways.
Yeah.
So like media projects, independent radio, all of the things that people who care about independent music have always sort of like looked to, just to support independent culture remain, also part of the solution,
Yeah,
I think.
I agree on that. Yeah. And do you think that Spotify is like following the trend? Other platforms like Netflix or YouTube are like the same story you are doing. Like, I don't care if what are they listening to. I only want to keep them in my platform, whatever they are doing, right? Like, they don't care about the quality, it's just the time you spend in their platform, so they can squeeze you with advertising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think it was around the same time that the first excerpt from my book came out in December in Harper's. There was this article in N+1 that came out called, I think it's called Casual Viewing, that was about Netflix and,
Hmm.
how different things that Netflix executives were telling filmmakers, direction that was being given to try to make films that people could more easily listen to in the background. So, like clearly similar to Spotify, there is this, desire to kind of like just keep people streaming in the background, whether or not they're actually paying attention, to try to squeeze as much listening time and as much data out of people as possible. All of these platforms are really concerned with things like boosting user engagement, and extending, listening session, or extending the time that a user spends in a given session. In my book, really interestingly, I reference this other book called Computing Taste by this researcher, Nick Seaver, and he kind of traces the history of recommendation systems and talks about how there's this distinct moment in the history of recommender systems where just simply the amount of time that someone spent on something started to be seen as this sort of signal of satisfaction, which is actually a lot different than like, asking for a thumbs up or a thumbs down, because you're just, this assumption that just because you've spent a lot of time on something, being, this signal of a positive experience, actually, like, that has a lot of implications for how a system, thinks about
Mhm.
value.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I love that article about Netflix. I read it and that's amazing. Yeah. Lately, I've been hearing or experiencing, to be honest, um,
Mhm.
shady practices related to Spotify playlists and companies acting as middlemen to get artists into the biggest playlist, paying, of course. In your research, did you come across anything related to this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely feel like it's a big issue. I've heard for years now stuff from musicians about how like um these instances where someone would sort of like, really release a scam track and tag them, and it shows up in their
Hmm.
tagged in their page, or all of a sudden like people are kind of scamming their way into other people's release radars. And I definitely feel like there is a need for, like more intervention there to try to prevent this stuff from happening. But I also think that it speaks volumes that these types of issues that independent artists, or artists, all kind of artists, honestly, have been dealing with for years, like, still haven't been resolved. And I don't know like exactly where the blame for that goes, but it seems like there hasn't been like a ton of uh, concern for, the ability of small independent artists to avoid situations where they're um, being scammed this way. But it also, I think, shows what the vulnerabilities are when so much of your connection with your audience is wrapped up in a platform like this, because it does make it, a lot more vulnerable to these sort of targeted
Hmm.
campaigns to kind of like, extract value from the listenership that musicians have built up on these platforms.
Yes, I'm telling this because in the last weeks I found fake companies promising to the bands they will get reviews in big music website if they pay them, and it's a total scam.
Hmm. Yeah, the fake blogosphere is something that has really like intrigued me for a really long time, because I feel like it was around the same time that I started covering streaming, I noticed that there were these kind of blogs that seemed like they really obviously were just kind of like pay to play websites. And that's been an interesting thing. Like I had a music blog in the late 2000s, and something that I even write about in the book is how like the rise of streaming kind of happened around the same time as the, so-called like golden age of the music blog era was winding down, and what it means that these things happen at the same time for independent music losing its own media ecosystem. And it is it's kind of sad, like seeing how so much of like the quote unquote like music blog world now is just kind of these websites that are asking people to pay to even be considered for editorial placement. It's so different from what the music blogosphere kind of represented in the 2000s.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Not that the future of TikTok in the US is not 100% clear. Well, it's unclear. Everything depends on Trump and Elon, I guess. Do you think that this position gives Spotify even a bigger advantage to position their platform as the go-to place for music discovery, like something monopolistic?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, it's hard to say exactly, like, what the current relationship or how, I'm not exactly sure, like, currently how Spotify sees itself in relationship to TikTok, but I definitely do think that something that was really interesting was talking to former employees and kind of just researching the ways in which, like, the rise of TikTok, like, had a big impact on Spotify and its, like, direction towards more personalization, like post 2020, and kind of like the impact that it had on the front page of Spotify and like the interface and things like that. I definitely think that, for a long time, it seems like they've sort of felt a pressure to compete with TikTok. So in some ways,
Pues sí. La última pregunta de la entrevista no se grabó. La herramienta que utilizo normalmente para grabar el podcast falló y no pude recuperar esa última parte de la entrevista. A ver, quedaban un par de minutillos y tampoco pasa nada, así que ya me perdonaréis no haber podido terminar como siempre la entrevista. Eso sí, os dejo con una fantástica música de ascensor y nos vemos en la próxima. Muchas gracias.